Joining us now is one of India's leading political figures. Shashi Tharoor is serving his second term in Parliament. He's a former federal minister and the spokesman for the Indian National Congress, India's opposition party. He joins us from Bucharest in Romania. Shashi, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
So, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has come to the United States. Lots of hype, lots of publicity, as we just saw in those pictures from Central Park. But was there any major policy achievements, anything of substance achieved during this visit?
No, I think that would not be the right way to look at it, in the sense that I think his biggest accomplishment on the visit was the fact that the visit took place at all. Just a few months ago, he was the object of a visa ban in the United States because of accusations of complicity in human rights violations in the state of Gujarat, of which he was chief minister when there were terrible, terrible killings 12 years ago. He had been demonized, including by my party and myself. He's now the Prime Minister, 1.2 billion people. He's won a convincing majority in Parliament. And so by going to the United States, he was seeking, as it were, a new acceptability. He wanted to introduce himself, really, to the American public and the American decision makers, the American political establishment, as somebody they could do business with. And I believe he's pretty much accomplished that. I can't see a lot else that can be totally tangible. He made a good speech at the UN General Assembly. He made a useful visit to Ground Zero, the site of the 9/11 attacks. He made a surprise visit to Central Park, where he stood alongside Hugh Jackman and spoke at a rock concert in aid of poverty. So he had these little extra touches. And of course, there was this gigantic affair in Madison Square Garden, where a sold-out house of Indian Americans, supporters of his, gave him a rock star welcome himself. And all of this certainly contributed to the atmospherics of his visit. But I would be hard-pressed to find anything particularly substantive that has come out of this.
Right, so the great success for him is the way he's been able to recast himself, reportray himself in American eyes, because in your words, he's a figure who was sectarian, authoritarian, divisive. He was, as you pointed out, demonized for his alleged role in the sectarian violence in India in 2002. So in that respect, it has been a success, hasn't it?
That's right. I mean, in a sense, I mean, as an Indian, even though I belong to the political opposition, I think that's just as well, because the Indo-US relationship is of importance to us as well as to them, I believe, to both countries. And it's important that our Prime Minister be able to parley on equal terms with the leaders of the world's oldest democracy. So for him to go to Washington and make this mark has undone a lot of the damage that had been done in the past, and has also, I would say, rolled back some of the fears and misgivings that many of us in India would have had about his acceptability in the United States. But when you look at the actual, what came out of the trip, you have the joint statement by the two of them with a poetic title in Hindi, Chalo Chalo Ek Saath, let's move together. There was a joint op-ed that Mr. Obama and Mr. Modi signed together in the Washington Post in Washington and the Economic Times in India. There was also the famous greeting to Mr. Modi in his native Gujarati by Mr. Obama, which was the kind of thing the Americans are very good at. I think they are excellent at these appearances. But if you look at the substance of the joint statement, I don't see any specific issue on which they've given anything to India. There was hopes of progress on defense technology. There is no concrete breakthrough there. There were hopes of progress in green technology. We have a working group or a committee to look into it, but nothing more than that. Whereas India had already conceded to the US on some of the patent protections that Big Pharma in America wanted, and that will cost Indian patients more when it comes to their medicines. So, I mean, looking at it from a purely Indian political point of view, I think it's going to be difficult for Mr. Modi's supporters to point to any specific achievement other than his acceptance, which I agree is a good thing for India. But I think that the Americans are also waiting to see what Mr. Modi delivers on the ground before they embrace his policies with enthusiasm. And we in India are waiting to see what the Americans will give us before we can say that this relationship is heading in the right direction.
He did appear, though, to be fully aware of the people, the audience that he was talking to. He said some things which must have been music to the ears of Americans, especially Americans on the right. He said government has no place in business. He met more than a dozen top CEOs. I mean, did those sentiments find some kind of acceptance among the Americans? I mean, Is this going to be translated into any concrete deals?
The challenge is going to be how to translate these sentiments into action. Two of his stock phrases on the Indian political stump are actually phrases that that Americans love to use and have used before Mr. Modi, namely, the government has no business being in business, and that I believe in minimum government, maximum governance. But the fact is that both of those ideas are yet to be translated into meaningful action. For example, when you speak about government not being in business, the Indian government under Mr. Modi still runs airlines, hotels, all sorts of businesses that normally you don't think the government needs to be in. And in Gujarat, where he was chief minister for 12 years, Mr. Modi did not either privatize or offload a single private sector enterprise or business. He simply said, I can run them better. So his pride was not in the government pulling out of business. It was in the government doing business better than it had done before. That, I'm not sure, is what the Americans are waiting to see. But, you know, the thing is that Mr. Modi really does talk a very good game. He has excellent sound bites. He comes across saying the right things. And I have to say, even within the Indian domestic context, he has said the right things since his election. What we need to see yet is, will he do the right things? And what things will he do that will make a tangible difference to the lives of the millions of Indians who voted for him with such high expectations? Equally, if you're looking at the American angle, the same consideration applies. What will Mr. Modi do to make those slogans reality and encourage or permit or incite American businesses to come in and invest or trade in larger quantities than they have before?
An Indian newspaper reported and said that Indians, especially the middle class in India, are very prickly about how they are seen around the world. They're very particular about India's pride, India's honor. They want a leader who's going to be heard, a leader who's going to be respected. Point is India taken seriously by the United States?
That's a very fair question, and I would say that we've had some ups and downs. Maybe down is the wrong word. We've never had, in the last 15 or 20 years, we never had a really bad period except when the previous BJP government, Mr. Modi's predecessors in the party, exploded a nuclear device that resulted in sanctions and a freezing of relations for a couple of years. But since then, since about 2000, it's been an uninterrupted saga of affection and bonhomie, except that the peak was actually achieved under George W. Bush. And under President Obama, it's been much more a period of what one might call stagnation, rather than of any glowing progress. Particularly over the last few years, not only have there been no big-ticket developments between the two countries, but the US has really looked like it has had other priorities. Even the pivot to Asia did not seem to take very much of India in its course. And then certainly the Americans have rightly been distracted by events in Afghanistan, in the Middle East, in East Europe with Ukraine. So there's a lot else on America's minds, and India has been relegated, I would say, to a back burner on a very, very low simmer. The question is, will Mr. Modi's arrival and the promise of a new resurgent India move India back to the front burner? It remains to be seen.
You did mention some areas where there is potential for greater cooperation, defense technology, environmental technology, acting against terrorists, etc. But if we look at the issues that divide these two countries, nuclear issues, intellectual property issues, there is also a perception that India has failed to open up its markets to American companies. We had, of course, the arrest and strip search of an Indian diplomat last year, which caused a lot of anger from India. Are we now past all that?
Well, past some of that. I mean, the intellectual property issue is what I mentioned earlier when I said that India gave in on the demands of Big Pharma on patent issues. There wasn't a whole lot else. India also has intellectual property protections, and India in many ways is a country that produces intellectual property, so there isn't a huge gap there. On trade, the setback under the Mr. Modi's government has been the decision of India to withhold its agreement to a WTO deal. And India's done so with Mr. Modi talking about protecting poor farmers. I consider that slightly cynical because, in fact, the principal beneficiaries of Mr. Modi's position are not the poor farmers, but the fat cat middlemen who are a reliable basis of political support and a vote bank for Mr. Modi's party. And that's what that's all about. And I think for political reasons, he may not back down on that. The strip search of the Indian diplomat was disgraceful, unforgivable, should never happen again. I think we have assurances it'll never happen again. It seems there's nothing the government is able to do about withdrawing the case against her filed by an overzealous attorney in New York State. But I think it's clear that this kind of situation will not be allowed to occur by the Americans. So to that degree, one can say it is now behind us.
Shashi Tharoor, thanks for joining us, sir.